Everyone. As a chocoholic, it's far not my usual mode to start something when chocolate is drawing people out there. We have several people in line waiting for the good chocolate, but we do, with these programs, try to stick very much to our time schedule so we get you out of here promptly at 8:30 or there-ish about. So anyway, good evening, everyone. And there are some, like a good pastor, there are some seats up front for shy people who want to sit closer but aren't sure. So we do have some seats up front. Good evening, everyone. Well, good evening. Yes. I'm Janet Dolan. I'm a member of the Minnesota Peace Initiative Committee. And on behalf of the Norway House, their board of directors, and our committee, I want to welcome all of you here to our spring program. I want to welcome also all of you who are joining us online, and you will realize every time I mention online, I look up like I'm going to see them or something, so I'll try not to do that. I also want to extend a very special welcome to the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations and the members from that group who are joining us here this evening. The committee is our co-sponsor for this event, and the committee is a membership organization that was founded in 1940 and is dedicated to better understanding global affairs. And we appreciate very much not only you joining us as co-sponsors, but certainly all of you who are here this evening. So we want you to know how much we appreciate it. For those of you attending for the first time, let me tell you who we are and why we do these programs. Norway is a trusted global peacemaker, and therefore, as part of the Norway House, the Minnesota Peace Initiative provides a forum to delve deeply into challenging global issues. Like James Madison, we believe a well-informed electorate is essential to effective democracy. We bring experts in, like our guest this evening, to share her knowledge and her insights so we all can become better informed. James Madison's quote is particularly relevant to tonight's program. Our program is on disinformation, all the disinformation that's coming to us every day, and especially in an election year. And it's also on why it's so prevalent today, and most importantly, how can we become more discerning consumers of information? It's tempting to think when you have a problem in your democracy that this has to be the first time a democracy has ever encountered this problem. However, disinformation goes back as far as 34 BC. The records suggest that Octavius used disinformation to undermine his political opponent, Mark Antony. Octavius did so by publishing a fake or maybe stolen document, which was allegedly the last will and testament of Mark Antony, in which Antony planned to leave his substantial Roman properties to Cleopatra and their children in Egypt, and this was in violation of Roman law. Octavius also issued coins of the realm with very unflattering images of both Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And, this is the really good part, he stamped on these coins short, disparaging comments about each. One commentator who wrote a story about this described these kind of snarky comments as our first tweets. The purpose of this disinformation was to arouse the anger and the mistrust of the Roman citizens, and it worked. The Roman Republic fell, and Octavius became Caesar Augustus, first emperor of Rome. Even in our earliest history, some used disinformation for political purposes. Ben Franklin, who is the subject of a current Apple TV series, in case you haven't checked it out yet, Ben Franklin used disinformation to arouse the emotion of British citizens, to get them to push their government to finalize treaty negotiations needed to gain our independence. Franklin published a completely false edition of a newspaper in which he made scurrilous claims about the collaboration between King George and some Native Americans to undermine our country. It was a totally false story, but it spread rapidly and it worked. The peace treaty was concluded shortly thereafter. However, the falsehoods that were circulated for decades and were not dispelled until the 1850s. On a lighter side, an important milestone in commercial use of disinformation was the Great Moon Hoax of 1834. The New York Sun newspaper published a 6-part article claiming that aliens lived on the moon and that the sun had exclusive drawings of these aliens. And just to show how true it was, they claimed that this was all developed by a very well-known and famous scientist in the UK. Of course, they did it unbeknownst to him. The purpose of the hoax was to pump up readership, and again, it worked. While it was quickly revealed to be a hoax, it was an early example of newspapers grabbing readers' attention with outlandish headlines and stories. In more recent times, the most well-known disseminator of disinformation was the Soviet Union. It actually established an office of disinformation in the early 1920s to undermine public support for the whites. Those were the former aristocrats who were in exile but who were trying to regain power in Russia. However, the most famous piece of disinformation published by Russia actually had to do with Japan. It was called the Tanaka Memorial. And it was a document that Russia claimed to the world that it had obtained from a spy in Japan in 1927. And the Tanaka Memorial alleged that Japan's imperial intentions were to first conquer Manchuria, then China, and ultimately disrupt and destroy the United States. This document was often called the Mein Kampf of the Imperial Japan. Despite being debunked many times because it had many factual errors in it, the belief in the authenticity of this document continued until the fall of the Soviet Union, when they finally opened up their records and it was established as a fake. So this brings us to today. While newspapers, TV, and radio can certainly perpetrate disinformation, our biggest source of disinformation is clearly the internet, which allows information to pass from person to person, from group to group, without any attribution of the source. Without sourcing, there's no basis for deciding the credibility of information. All information disseminated through social media can appear equal as to truthfulness, credibility, and reliability. It's a daunting task to try to understand where we are, where we're going, and what we can do about this flood of disinformation. However, we have with us this evening an expert who is the go-to person on the subject of disinformation. She is Barbara McQuade, author of the New York Times bestseller, Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. In addition to writing, she's also a frequent contributor to NBC News and MSNBC on legal matters and matters of disinformation and misinformation in our political process. She's also the member of a very popular weekly podcast called #SistersInLaw, along with Joyce Vance, Kimberly Atkins Storr, and Jill Winebanks. Oh, and in her spare time, she's also a professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. And prior to that, she served as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan from 2010 to 2017. We're going to begin this evening with remarks by Ms. McQuade. Then I will join Ms. McQuade for a fireside chat. She and I will also be joined by the Honorable John Thunheim, Federal District Judge for the District of Minnesota. In addition to his years of service on the bench, Judge Thunheim has devoted his career to helping build democracies around the world. Judge Thunheim will join Ms. McQuaid and me to add perspective about the use of disinformation globally. After our discussion, we'll take questions from you. For those of you joining us virtually, please submit your questions online through the Q&A function on your computer, and I have it from the tech folks here. You'll find it in the right-hand corner. For those of you here in person, we are providing cards for you to write your questions and pass them to the center aisle where they will be collected. We will ask as many questions as time will allow. It does take some effort to organize the questions, so please submit them as soon as possible. Following the Q&A portion, Tom Hansen, chair of the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, will wrap up our discussion on disinformation. Tom is a former U.S. Foreign Service diplomat Foreign Service officer with the Department of State. He currently is diplomat in residence at the Atworth Institute for International Affairs at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. And he also has taught diplomacy at Carleton College. Tom is active in many organizations, and he speaks extensively throughout the world on topics of diplomacy and international relations. We're going to begin with opening remarks by Barbara McQuaid. Following her remarks, she and I will be joined by Judge Thunheim. Again, we appreciate very much all of you coming out on what is a glorious May evening. So glad you chose us as your evening entertainment tonight. And we also want to thank all the people who have joined us live. We hope you'll enjoy our program very much, and we're going to begin now with opening remarks by Ms. McQuaid.
Well, thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here tonight. What a wonderful, glorious day, and what a wonderful resource you have here in Norway House. I'm deeply impressed. It's a beautiful facility, and what a wonderful mission in a wonderful location. I had a chance to meet so many nice people before the event tonight at a reception, and I learned what it means to be Minnesota nice. So thank you. Although someone told me that Minnesota nice is just disinformation for passive aggressive. They were really nice, but did they mean it? I don't know. It's sort of like when someone introduces me, and Janet, thank you for that nice introduction, as an expert on disinformation. Am I an expert on disinformation, or you're an expert on disinformation? Those are kind of two different things, but I thank you for that very nice introduction, and thank you all very much for being here. I wrote this book on disinformation because it is an issue that I'm very interested in, and it concerns me very much as a threat to our national security. I spent most of my career as a national security prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Detroit, and now I teach a course on national security at the University of Michigan Law School. And during the years I've been involved in national security, I have seen the greatest threats to our national security evolve from, first Al-Qaeda, and then it was ISIS, and then it was China and Russia and cyber intrusions. And now I think the greatest threat to national security is disinformation, but coming from within our own country. I first became interested in this topic teaching my students about Russian disinformation in about 2018. I assigned my students to read portions of the Mueller report. And I know sometimes people think mostly about the Mueller report regarding what he did or did not find relating to the Trump presidential campaign in 2016. I assign it to my students to help them understand how Russia used disinformation in an effort to interfere with our presidential elections, and those efforts continue to this day. And I think that one of the reasons that disinformation has become such an acute problem at this moment in our nation's history is a confluence of two events. Certainly, as Janet said, disinformation has been with us since the dawn of time, and that is certainly true, whether it's propaganda or spin or outright lies by our government. Those things have certainly always been with us. But I think there are a couple things now that are really elevating the problem. And one is certainly social media. The idea that any one of us can send a message to anyone in the world, can reach millions of people in an instant, and that we can do so anonymously. That is a significant challenge. The other thing that I think is going on right now that makes this such an acute problem is our incredibly polarized electorate. Since the late 90s, early 2000s, both political parties have worked very hard to try to energize their base as a matter of political strategy. And it used to be that both parties during general elections would try to cultivate voters in the middle, the swing voters, and appeal to the persuadables that maybe were independents or would kind of swing back and forth between elections. But the strategy then became to appeal to the base, double down on the base, because if those people showed up at the polls, they were reliably in your column. And so how do you get them to show up and vote? By getting them excited or angry or scared about just how bad the other side is. And if I can persuade you that the other side is terrible, then I will present myself as the only tenable option. And I think that the 2 decades we have spent with those political strategies have left us in a place where we care more about our political tribe than we do about issues. We care more about tribe than we do about truth. I talk to my students, and it's interesting to see how they think about their views on political issues. When I was in college and first formulating my own views on various issues, whatever the issues of the day were, nuclear power, gun control, affirmative action, abortion, guns, whatever it was, I kind of thought about the issue. I tried to learn as much as I could on all sides of the issue, and I formulated an opinion. And on some issues, I may have been more conservative than others. On some issues, I may have been more progressive on others. But I was just kind of, thinking all these things through one by one, the cafeteria style plan. Now, I find so many of my students are almost reverse engineering their views based on the view of the party they most align with. If I consider myself aligned with the Republican Party, what's the party line on those things? Then I line up accordingly. If I consider myself more in line with the Democratic Party, I ask what are all their views, and I line up accordingly. And in fact, if you express a view that is different from the party line on social media, there is concern that you will be ousted from your tribe, that you will be branded someone who is not loyal and not faithful and not really one of us. You see that from time to time. Certainly Liz Cheney has paid the price for that, for daring to call out what she saw on January 6th. She has been primaried, lost her election. I think she knew that that was part of the deal when she went down that road. But the idea that people care more about this tribe than they care about the truth, I think is very dangerous to democracy. We are no longer deciding issues based on what's the best policy. We are deciding it based on our vision of what America ought to be. And that is a dangerous place to be, I will submit. I also think that we are going through a time where, though some of us are genuinely misinformed by what we see online, there are others who don't care and who are willing to join in with the false claims if it means it will advance their own political agenda, their own profit agenda, or their own personal agenda and their career. I mean, we now are hearing people who want to be vice president repeating the phrase hostages when referring to the January 6th defendants in hopes, I think, of currying favor and advancing their own political careers. They're not hostages. There's no evidence that anyone is being held as political prisoners for attacking the Capitol on January 6th. Those are crimes. As a former prosecutor, I think those crimes are valid. People have been charged with assaulting police officers or damaging property or engaging in seditious conspiracy or obstructing an official proceeding. To call them hostages is a betrayal of the rule of law. And I think that these willingness to go along with the con is causing severe damage to our country. It's harming our democracy, it's harming public safety and national security, and it's harming the rule of law. With regard to democracy, I think we are seeing disinformation coming. It will be coming from Russia, from China, from North Korea, from Iran, but also coming from within our own country. And this time around, we also have artificial intelligence along the way to give a little boost to these false claims. I think as the election approaches, I am concerned about a number of things. One is efforts to influence our choice of candidates by saying false things about one candidate or another. And, you know, at the highest level, I'm not so worried about it. If somebody says something false about Donald Trump or Joe Biden, they have the mechanisms to refute those false claims. I'm more worried about down ballot races, right? People running for state house, people running for city council or county government, where they don't have the resources to debunk false claims that are online. I was speaking in Cleveland last week, and a woman there who was a member of the city council shared with me a video that got pushed out by her opponent, claiming that she had discriminated against African-American citizens who had come to a city council meeting, when it couldn't be further from the truth. She was gaveling peace in the crowd to try to quiet them down so that they could have debate. But it was impossible for her to debunk that before the election. And so that is a concern that I have, this AI-generated things to smear candidates. I think disinformation will be used to dampen voter turnout. One of the things in the Mueller report that I share with my students is how Russia, the Internet Research Agency, set up a number, thousands of fake accounts on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other social media platforms with fake accounts with names that looked like American political activists. They had names like Blacktivist or United Muslims of America or Tennessee GOP or Heart of Texas. And they said a lot of things consistent with those identities for many, many months leading up to the election. But then as we got close to the election, started saying extreme things like Heart of Texas, pushing people for a platform plank that said Texas should secede from the United States. And that plank actually ended up on the platform of the state of Texas in that election. Blacktivist posted, Hillary Clinton has never done anything for our community. We should send her a message by staying home on election day. Our community, right? Talking to black voters, when in fact, this is some Russian guy in a hoodie in a boiler room in Moscow. But sharing that message with people, if even only a few people in a swing state that was decided by a narrow margin believe that to be true, it could have an outcome on the election. So that's election dampening. And then the last one is just creating destabilization in our belief in the system of elections, attacking democracy by attacking the results, that they're not reliable, that democracy doesn't work. This harms our national security around the world. Since World War II, as you well know, it has been the foreign policy of the United States to lift up democracies around the world because we believe that democracies around the world make us safer. When other countries have democratic forms of government, there are fewer wars, there are fewer refugee crises, and we have more and better trade partners. And so when democracies are failing and backsliding, as we are seeing around the world, that is a threat to our own national security. When people in other countries saw the attack on our Capitol on January 6th, in Russia, there was an official who said, you see that American democracy is limping on both feet. This is evidence that democracy does not work. In China, President Xi said, democracy is not the goal, prosperity is the goal. You need a strong leader. Democracy doesn't work. A strong leadership in government is your secret to prosperity. And so these things are harming our national security. And finally, it is harming the rule of law. When we see people attacking our police departments, when we see people attacking our courts and undermining credibility, that causes people to doubt the reliability of our courts. For centuries, we have had disputes in this country. And when we have disputes, we decide them at the ballot box or in courts of law. When people undermine the credibility of those institutions through disinformation, it causes people to want to take the law into their own hands, and that results in civil unrest. I believe that is what is to blame for the man who attacked an FBI office in Cincinnati the day after the search warrant was executed at Mar-a-Lago. That man posted online that the FBI was the enemy and that good patriots had to take action. He went to that FBI office with an assault weapon. He was chased away and killed in a standoff because he was trying to take the law into his own hands. There was a man known as the MAGA bomber, Cesar Sayoc in Georgia, who sent pipe bombs through the mail to members of the media and leaders in the Democratic Party because he believed them to be the enemy of the people. And of course, January 6th, I think, is the ultimate act of vigilante violence, trying to use brute force to get a result in an election in accordance with the will of a small minority of people as opposed to the will of the people in an election. And so disinformation is, I think, the greatest threat to our national security today. I think there are solutions to this. I am pleased to say that the chapter in my book on solutions is the longest chapter in the book. It's not all doom and gloom and bleak, and I know we're going to talk about some of those solutions when we talk with our fireside chat here, but I think there are a number of things we can do to address both the supply side of disinformation through some common sense regulation and the demand side of disinformation through media literacy, through civics education, and through a commitment to all of us to choosing truth over tribe. I'll end it there, and I look forward to answering your questions as the evening proceeds.
Is it on? Okay. That's always the first test, you know. Well, Barbara, thank you very much for laying the foundation or setting the table for our discussion this evening. I'm going to lead off with a question for you, and then I have some for both you and Judge Thunheim. Before we get too deep in the weeds of what do we do about it, I wanted to kind of look at the problem at like a 35,000 foot level, which is, are we really seeing this burst of disinformation because social media is so new? I mean, it really has only been around a handful of years, and we all know that, you know, really big new technology is disruptive when it comes. Whether it's the printing press or whether it's whatever it is, it's very disruptive. But then society adapts and figures out how to put some guardrails in and make it work well. So is it really more also just a question of timing? We're seeing this burst, but it's because it's so new. Do you think, you know, we will get rules of the road in place? I know you've got some that you suggest, but I mean, do you think that this is a really bad issue and it's a particularly bad in election year, but we've been through this before and we'll learn how to manage it as a society?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, if social media were human, we'd be in those awkward teenage years, right? We haven't quite figured it all out yet. We're bumbling along, stumbling along. In 1996 is when, and I know we're going to talk about this later, Congress passed Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And if you read that statute from 1996, the internet sounds like the most wonderful thing ever invented. And it really is in some ways. Like, there's this, hey guys, this is Congress. There's this wonderful thing, and it's called the internet. And it can connect you with anyone around the world, and you can do creative things, and it's going to do social good. You can almost like see the birds flying or fluttering around like a Disney movie, right? And the butterflies. It's so beautiful. And that was true then, but I think that, you know, as time has gone on, we have seen all the ways in which this wonderful tool can be used as a weapon. It's sort of like raising a baby alligator in your bathtub, It's adorable while it's still a baby, but at some point it grows into a man-eating predator. And you can no longer treat it the same way you did when it was a baby alligator. And I think that's where we are. I think we haven't quite figured it out. I think the tech companies are resistant to any sort of regulation because, although maybe they want to be good corporate citizens, the business of business is business. And so their motive is profit with as little oversight as possible. And it's complicated. It's evolving quickly. But we've been able to do hard things before. We've put a man on the moon. We've been through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, a civil war. I think we'll get there, but it's not going to happen by itself. We need to have an understanding of the issues and an urgency and the political will to make these changes.
This is a question for both of you, Judge Thunheim and Barbara. And maybe, Judge Thunheim, we'll start with you. And both of you, both as prosecutor and as federal judge, are well steeped in constitutional law. So do you think we can strike a balance between First Amendment rights, free speech, and the ability to protect the public from abuse of the internet through disinformation? I mean, is there a balance there, or are we going to have to give up one to have the other?
It's a good question, Janet. And, I think just thinking back to 1996, I think we were still calling it the World Wide Web.
The information superhighway.
That's right. We were really worried about getting internet service providers out there to work, and I think no one had any idea about social media at the time, which suggests something that we might talk about later, which is some amendments to Section 230. The First Amendment is powerful. We all know that, but it's not absolute. Freedom of speech is not absolute. Most hate speech is not protected. Perjury is not protected. If you lie under oath, even if it's a relatively minor lie, it's perjury, and it's not protected. False and misleading advertising is not protected. So we do have an ability to manage our affairs under the First Amendment and make sure that we address the proper balance between freedom of speech and making sure that we regulate. Social media companies are really, depending on what the issue is, they are both a platform, which is convenient for Section 230 and their immunity that they get from just passing along what people say on their sites, and the First Amendment when they are challenged by a state which wants to regulate them. I mean, they fight back with the First Amendment. So they use the First Amendment when it's convenient, but then on the platform idea, they really don't have to worry about any kind of First Amendment challenge there. So, I mean, I think we can balance that. I think what we need to do is find a way to make sure that Section 230 is balanced in a way that social media companies do have an obligation, if they want immunity, which is important to them, if they want immunity, they have to protect the public from certain harmful material that is not protected by the First Amendment, a balancing test. And all they have to show then would be reasonable steps to take in order to protect the public from disinformation. So I think there's a way to do it. Will we do that as a country? That's to be determined, I guess, because the social media companies have become extraordinarily powerful. No question about that. When you have mentioned, Janet, when those CEOs go before Congress, it's not much of a fight. And they also have some of the best lobbyists in the world. But I think there's a way to do it. The First Amendment does not protect a lot of the disinformation that you would see on social media. It's just that they're protected through this immunity that was granted in 1996 when we were worried about developing the World Wide Web.
Barbara, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and Judge, it's so good to hear you talk about how the First Amendment is not absolute, because I do think that that is something that sometimes members of the public don't understand. You know, every part of the Constitution has to be interpreted with every other part of the Constitution. And so, although there is right to free speech, you have to temper that with, you know, the right to protect and defend and provide for the common defense and all the other things there. And as Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson once said, the Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact. And so we can criminalize things like threats and perjury and conspiracy and fraud and other kinds of things. But I think that the place to begin with reform may be not with content, but with process. I think that's an easier lift. That's the low-hanging fruit in terms of regulation for social media. I, too, have seen those congressional hearings where you've got the CEOs lined up. You know, you've got Mark Zuckerberg there and Jack Dorsey and some of these other guys. And the members of Congress are up there asking questions. And, you know, they ask a pretty good first question because some staffer has researched and prepared a really good one. And then the answer comes back where they're talking about algorithms and digital this and that. And suddenly you see their eyes glaze over. You know what they remind me of is, have you ever seen those TV ads for Progressive Insurance about becoming your parents? Those hit a little too close to home for my age demographic. My kids laugh a little too hard at those ads. But I feel like, you know, it's like Lindsey Graham is up there saying, am I hashtagging right now? You know, those members of, it's difficult stuff. And so I think they can say a few buzzwords and, you know, the members of Congress just, you know, this is too hard. We can't do this. But I do think that the place to begin is process-based things as opposed to content, because that is not protected by the First Amendment. So things like the algorithms. We know from a whistleblower who used to work at Facebook, she was a data scientist named Frances Haugen, that one of the things that Facebook does is to program its algorithms, you know, these are just the computer programs that tell the platforms what to do, to prioritize content that is likely to generate outrage. You know, when we hit don't like or hate as the emoji, that tells it to go to the top of everybody else's feed. And the reason they do that is because that keeps you online longer, and the longer you're online, the more they can sell advertisements for. So anger equals money for Facebook. And so, you know, why can't we regulate the algorithms, the processes, the computer code, and even if we can't tell them what to do, at least require disclosure of what it is they're doing so that we know if we're being manipulated. I think we could also regulate the way they scrape our private data and sell it to data brokers, who in turn sell it to political consultants and to commercial enterprises. You know, they know us better than we know ourselves. From everything we like and share, they have collected so much information about us. They know what we're thinking at any time. I get bombarded with ads for Detroit Tigers baseball caps. Yes, I do want one. How did you know? They know us, and because they know us so well, they're able to micro-target us with political ads and with consumer ads in ways that are invisible to other people. And so we're seeing things that are different from what other people are seeing. I have a sister, you know, we have a lot in common, and yet she will frequently say things like, oh, did you hear about X? I'll say, no, I didn't hear anything about X. Well, it's all over Facebook. Not on my Facebook feed, because we're being micro-targeted. If my own sister, with whom I have so much in common, is seeing something so different from what I am, imagine how different it is for all of us. That's because they're micro-targeting us. And so couldn't we change the way they are taking our data and monetizing it and using it against us? I think so. And finally, a last one I'll suggest is the bots that are online. I think we could forbid social media companies from permitting bots to be on their platforms. You know, these are these artificial intelligence created accounts that look like real people. They might have a name like Patriot Girl or War Eagle or something that sounds very patriotic. And in fact, it's just computer software. And they're programmed to look for buzzwords to pick fights with you. You know, if you're talking about guns, gun control, they're going to pick a fight with you and call you names. Or if you talk about some other hot button issue, they're going to pick a fight with you and call you names. And after a while, if you respond, you realize you're just arguing with software. Not a winning formula. And these bots can also be used to amplify disinformation, to like and share it, to make its reach expand exponentially. So I think those are some starting points where we could do some regulation on social media that would not run afoul of the First Amendment.
I'm not going to look up Detroit Tiger baseball caps.
Well, speaking of people having difficulty understanding,
One of the things people have difficulty understanding is why we aren't doing something about this. You know, and we've mentioned Rule 230 here, Section 230, I should say, quite a bit. I hear more people say, how can they say things on social media that the newspapers could never get away with? And so people don't understand, how can they do that? And the answer always is 230. You can't do anything unless you change 230. So do you think there is it politically viable? And if it is, what should they do to 230? And what is palatable and what's further out there?
Yeah, so again, I think I would start by saying you are immune, if you are immune from content, but not from the things you put out on social media. So your design of the algorithms, your permission of bots, your permission to scrape data and sell your own collection of data and sale. Those are not, you know, free speech things. But it's complicated because, as the judge said, we've got this description in Section 230 that they're just the platform, you know, the utility, providing the lines. But there's also a case where they are talking about their ability to remove content as content moderators, and they say, well, like any other publisher, we have the ability to exercise editorial discretion. So they kind of want to have it both ways a little bit there. And so I think that creates some challenges. But my focus, I think, would be on process. And in addition to the three things I just mentioned, I also think we could do some things regarding political ads that would help in terms of labeling ad content. So when you see an ad on television or you hear one on the radio, you will always hear the candidate say, you know, I'm Amy Klobuchar and I approve this ad. You don't have to do that on social media, on the internet, anywhere. And so it could look like the red, white, and blue grandmothers of America are you know, asking you to do X, Y, or Z, or supporting this bill. And in fact, it's special interest, or one guy, or some industry organization. And so I think we could require disclosure of those things online. So I think there are some things we could do without directly addressing this content thing, which I think is a heavier lift. Could we do it? Sure, because the First Amendment is not absolute. But I think that would be a starting place, and I'd like to see how much disinformation can we get rid of in this way before we address content, which I concede is a little bit challenging.
Yeah, I think that the companies are doing some of this. I mean, there's no question about that. Facebook does take a look at what is posted, and they remove some postings. This changes from time to time. X doesn't do nearly as much of that right now. I think they're doing that just to prevent changes to Section 230. But see, we're already doing this. You don't have to regulate us. You don't have to change. But giving them absolute immunity, which is what Section 230 does, in an effort to develop the internet, it had nothing to do with social media, I think is a mistake. We give immunity throughout our system in various places. When Ms. McQuaid was U.S. Attorney, she had immunity from being sued for most everything unless she went out of her lane. You know, we give immunity to police officers so that they can do their work, but if they go too far, they don't have the immunity anymore. And I think we could do the same thing in 230. I don't know exactly what the standard would be, but let's look at reasonability. And if there's disinformation everywhere on a social media platform, maybe that should be a cause for liability. Newspapers can be sued for defamation. For libel, if there's something that is in their publication that is untrue. And so why can't we do the same thing with social media without any real difficulty? They don't want it, of course, and they're trying to prevent that, but I think that is an answer, to have them do more robust searching of what is put on their social media account, so that we can have less disinformation spread among the people.
Do you think one way to do the actual structural change is to kind of chip away? There seems to be support on both sides of the aisle to start looking at the most vulnerable, teenagers, and how they're being impacted. Do you think you could see that we might be able to start carving out exceptions for particular groups, especially ages, and then start, once you start, then you can keep adding on, but you think that might be a tactic or a strategy?
I think that might help. It might, we have a history of incremental regulation that seems to work as we go forward to get something more significant. But, if they are truly a platform, then where's the First Amendment problem? They're a platform, they're not a publisher. Then they'll claim they're a publisher, of course, and the First Amendment governs everything. So we're in this quandary of, which hat are they wearing, the Twins hat or the Tigers hat? We don't know. And so, I think an incremental approach might work.
First of all, we're getting very good questions from the audience, so I will move to those very shortly. But Judge Thunheim, you're out in the world looking at disinformation, or certainly experiencing disinformation in other parts of the world. They're not limited by either our First Amendment or our Rule 230. Are there any, really great places or great steps that are being taken outside of the United States where they're really ahead of us, or they're really setting a model for what could be done to handle disinformation?
Well, I think there are. I think that there's a really bad idea that much of the world employs right now, and that is criminalizing putting any kind of disinformation on social media or on the internet. And authoritarian governments use that as they see fit, so they can put people in prison who they don't like. So that's done in a lot of different places right now. Transparency is a good idea that's been adopted in a number of countries, where if there's an ad or anything that's placed on social media, you have to know who placed it there and who paid for it. It's something that gives us some problems because of the ill-advised Citizen United decision. But at the same time, I think that has worked. I know that Australia does this quite successfully. Media literacy education, which Barbara mentioned earlier, is a really good idea and something we could do a whole lot more of here in this country. I'd like to see television ads, teaching people what to look for on social media when they're there. That's being done. Canada has a good plan. The Netherlands has a really good plan. A lot of Western democracies have focused on teaching their citizens how to spot disinformation. Civil penalties are used in some countries for tech companies that do not adequately police what is on their site. Germany has done this with some success. I'm not sure how much. Denmark has a robust approach to spending a lot more on law enforcement to try to catch the Russian hackers who are getting in, or the Chinese companies that are creating the bots. I think that there are a lot of ideas around the world that could be used. Even Mexico, there's a government fact-checking site that is very helpful for people to look at to determine whether something is real or not. So there are good ideas, but not the idea of criminalizing putting any information on disinformation on a site.
Okay, thank you. Someone has asked, and I'm going to take their question but leverage it and make it a little bit larger question. They're asking, are there good ways to make social media less anonymous? So I'd like to hear a response to that. But I'd like to take that up a notch and say, the social media companies chose certain operating models when they got started. So they chose advertising versus subscription. They obviously chose anonymous as one of the ways that you could take part in what they're offering. Can we find ways to incent them to tweak or change their operating models? I mean, can we, or is it too late? The horses left the barn, and all we can do is try to, force what little little changes we can. But the basic operating models are there, and it's too late to do anything about that. Anonymity is a big part of that.
Yeah, I don't think it's too late to change anything. I mean, I think that they can pivot very quickly. We've seen that when new platforms emerge. You know, and it seems like every couple of years a new one becomes prevalent. You know, for a while there was something called MySpace that was very popular. That's gone now. Twitter was all the rage at one point, and then I know some people lost trust in it when it became X. There was a time when Facebook was where all the college people were. Now that's for the old people, right? That's for your annoying aunt on Facebook. A lot of young people like Snapchat or Instagram, TikTok, which certainly has some issues. So I think these things change from time to time, and so I think to tell tech companies that you may no longer have anonymous accounts online, I think that's something that we could do overnight. Now, that particular question, I think, is a little fraught. In some ways, I'd really like to see it because, you know, reading the Mueller report, this is how Russia was able to fool so many Americans into believing they were reading the posts of fellow Americans. This Tennessee GOP site was even used to plan a political rally where they hired people showed up, and they believed that it was all run out of this Tennessee GOP political activist, when in fact it was a Russian who set this whole thing up. And so to require people to be verified users, and some accounts do this, so you know, on X you can be a verified user and get a blue check if you show your driver's license and you use your real photo and you use your real name. I suppose there are some tricks around that, but at least they make a bona fide effort to make sure a person is who they say they are. So I think it can be done technologically. The counter argument to that, though, is, I think, legitimate, which is if you live in a country and want to speak truth to power and speak out against your government, perhaps you need anonymity to be able to do that, that people would not feel comfortable speaking out against their government using their real name. So I think that's a valid argument. But going to your bigger question about making these changes, I suppose it depends on what the change is, but I think if the law were to change tomorrow and say you can't scrape data or you have to verify users, I think they'd have to get into compliance with the law. You know, maybe you do one of these, as you sometimes see, Judge, 90-day ramp-up things, you know, or within 6 months you must comply. But I think we, the people, have the power to set the limits.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add something that complicates everything here, and that is the use of artificial intelligence. If you look at the election in Taiwan in January, there was extraordinary interference by the Chinese, unknown. They even used artificial intelligence to create news anchors who then spread false stories about the election. And actually a false story about a former president in Taiwan endorsing someone who he had never endorsed. And people saw all of this. And I think it might be just a warm-up for other elections, because about half the people in the world are going to vote in a democratic election this year. And so there's a lot of opportunity for the Chinese. And by the way, the site used was owned by the owner of TikTok. So artificial intelligence was used in a way that I can see that being used extensively in the United States if we don't do something about it.
Well, we do have a couple questions on TikTok. I realize it's a big question, but you know, what is the problem with TikTok, and why is our government taking the action it is? It's kind of the basic question, you know, just.
Well, TikTok is owned by a Chinese company that has not really, I mean, they promise that they don't hand over information that they learn from TikTok subscribers to the Chinese government, but they're governed by the Chinese government, and I think it's probably impossible to believe that they are not doing what President Xi asked them to do. And that's the issue right there, the fact that they can spy on TikTok users whenever they want to and gather information, and perhaps even have access for disinformation. And that's I'm not exactly sure how they do it, but they are the owners of TikTok. There's a TikTok United States that they claim is semi-independent, but I'm not sure. What do you think? Are they independent at all?
Well, they have set up a facility in Texas where they say all the data is stored. But I share your skepticism, Judge, that I think that because of the connection to the Chinese government, even though, you know, the harm is pretty speculative. There is not documented evidence that the Chinese government has done X, but because of the way the government is involved in business in China, it would be impossible for us to verify that there is not. It's like proving the negative. And I think in addition to the things that you've talked about, one is influence campaigns, in the same way we talked about how Russia used all of these social media platforms for influence campaigns. TikTok could be used for influence campaigns. But also, one of the things that China has been involved in recent years is collecting the personal data of all of us. When I was in government, there was a big breach of government personnel by China collecting information. And we all got this, credit recovery system, and nobody had a problem with their credit. And we were told, it's not the credit they want. It's all of your data and all of your kids' data and everything about you, because they can use that someday for influence operations, or they can use it for espionage recruitment tactics. And so it's an incredibly powerful weapon to put in the pocket of every young person, this spying device. And I think that's the fear.
So Janet, you should be worried about your TikTok account.
Yes. You got to put it on a burner phone. That's the way to do it.
Well, sometimes you are just amazed how something goes from 0 to 60. We have 5 grandchildren, 2 of whom are preteens and teenagers, and maybe no less than 2 years ago, I mean, it seems like it's no less than 2 years ago, they started talking about TikTok. And their dad wouldn't let them have TikTok, but they know about it, you know what I mean? But anyway, so they're explaining to me, and then they were with a friend, and they said, here, Grandma, look at this. And it's these little videos, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, this is some kid thing, And pretty soon Congress is talking about TikTok, and I go, is this the same TikTok I was looking at with a 12-year-old? But it is. So the growth of it, the numbers of the growth of TikTok, the users of TikTok, it's like more than all the other social media companies put together, and the profitability of it. It is a juggernaut in the social media world. It just is. So anyway, I'm going to take another question from the audience here, but again, kind of move it up a notch. The question is, well, what about the FCC? And do we already, have an agency whose job is to do something, and are they not managing this? And I'm going to elevate that to say, do we have a government? Our government was largely set up in the industrial age, and it was set up to deal with the operating model of the United States under the industrial age, and we're now in the digital age. Do we have a government that really is organized and capable of making the changes necessary, or do we have to start to kind of develop new agencies and new processes to manage the digital age that we didn't have to have in the industrial age?
Yeah, well, I can talk about the FCC, and I don't know what the remedy is, but the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, covers things that are on the broadcast spectrum. So television and radio have to be licensed because there's only a finite number of spaces on that broadcast spectrum. So you have to have a license if you want to broadcast. Cable television is not on the broadcast spectrum. They come through wires, and so they are not regulated by the FCC. If you've ever wondered why cable television looks very different from broadcast television, that's why. And the same when it comes to social media. The FCC does not regulate anything relating to social media. Now, could we put it under the umbrella of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission? Perhaps. They're the agency that deals with truth in advertising, so perhaps. But a lot of what is on social media is this immunity from liability because we're just the utility. We just put out the lines and other people can come. So I do agree with you, Janet, that I think we have not yet figured out how we want to regulate this social media space in the digital world, and that maybe some of those congressional regulations would require the creation of some federal agency. But of course, we're living in a time with the dismantling of the administrative state as opposed to the building up of the administrative state. So I don't know if there's the political appetite to do that.
And I don't know that Congress would have to assign the responsibility. They couldn't do it on their own. So again, this requires Congress to take action, and that's, what's the latest polls, the trust level in Congress? I think it's around 8 or 9%. So I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Speaking of dismantling the government, do either of you have detailed information on Project 2025, the idea of actually removing the tenure of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats in Washington? Is that a real possibility?
Yeah, I can touch on that one, and Judge, I don't know if you want to talk about it as well. There is something, the Civil Service Act has a number of schedules, and various government employees get assigned to different schedules. At the very end of the last Trump administration, he created a brand new schedule called Schedule F, and it was for people who are in any position that was involved in any way in policymaking could be fired at the president's will. And so instead of being part of the career civil service, where you could only be fired for just cause and you have hearings and other rights to things, they would become political positions. And it's tens of thousands of positions that would be affected by this, which to me is just poor government. The Civil Service Act was first passed sometime in the 1800s, and before that it was very much a spoils system. A new president would come in and his brother-in-law would get a great job in the cabinet, or his buddy or his biggest donor would get some job as the postmaster general or whatever it may be. And we moved to this civil service model with the idea of having professional career people working in government across administrations in a nonpartisan way. So people working at the CDC and the EPA, dealing with our nuclear arsenal and our power grid, are people who are there administration after administration after administration, and they're kind of a buffer from a president. I mean, this is what is sometimes referred to as the deep state. They are there to say, you can't do that. That would be, that's political, and we do things based on the law, and the law requires that we comply with these regulations, and so that's what we're going to do. And so it means radical change is hard to make, but it also means radical change is hard to make, right? And so some of those, that's what accounts for some of the stability in our government. But with this Project 2025, a big part of it is to restore. So President Biden repealed Schedule F, would be to restore Schedule F. And at the tail end of the Trump administration, when we had it before, it had not yet been implemented. It was on the books, but no one had been fired under this. I think we would see that very seismic change in government. And regardless of which party's in power, it's just not good government to have all of those jobs turning over every 4 years without the institutional knowledge I think we need for things like science and medicine.
And one of the problems before we had the civil service system, and this is a long time ago now, but when you got paid, if you were in that class that could be fired, you'd have to turn over part of your earnings to governor, president, whoever had appointed you, or you'd lose your job. And that was one of the reasons to eliminate this spoils system. And there's always a danger of something like that coming back.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have several questions on what can I do? So one of the first questions is, how can each of us better identify the source of the information we're getting? Are there things we can do that we don't know about? Or are there tricks that are not trick, but are there methods that we should be following? So how do we do a better job of being able to identify the source of information?
Yes, so I think this is a great question. Thank you for whoever asked it. One of the things, it's so useful to look, I think, to the lessons of other countries, and one of them is Finland, which has done an excellent job in terms of educating their youth about how to be better consumers of media through media literacy. And so there are things that they've adopted there that we can adopt here that are pretty basic. One is making sure you have more than one source of news for information. I was on a plane today coming here, and I saw a number of people with Fox News up on their TV screen. And that's fine, but if you watch Fox News, you should also watch other channels. If you read one newspaper, you should read multiple newspapers. If you listen to the radio, listen to multiple stations, because it's important, not only because some stations might not be presenting the full truth, but I think more importantly, it may be that the editorial decision-making they're making is, you might not be hearing the whole truth. You might be hearing their view of what's important, because they are gatekeepers in terms of their editorial judgment about what they want to share with you. And so if you really want to know what's going on in the world, I think you need multiple sources of news. I've actually begun looking at the BBC because it turns out we're not the only country in the world. You know, who knew? Who knew? We're so egocentric here. So that's real useful, even when it comes to American news, but world news as well. So I think that's one. When you see a headline that is shocking to you, you should look for a second source. Sometimes you might see something that you believe to be true, and it turns out not true at all, and looking for a second source is useful. Don't just read the headline, read the story. Sometimes, you know, the headlines these days, with apologies to our journalists in the room, I know you don't write the headlines, the headlines are often clickbait. You know, something that's really sensational is the headline, and you read the article and it doesn't resemble the headline at all, right? The headline might say something like, "World to end soon," and then you read the article and it says something like, "No experts think," you know, it's just the opposite of what the headline says. So you've got to read beyond that. Understanding the difference between causation and correlation, right? Just because two things happen doesn't mean that one caused the other. If you see a statistical study, look at the data set. How large was the sample size? Was it 2 million subjects or was it 2? That can make a big difference. And then there are also some good fact-checking sites out there. So if you read something like, here's one I looked up recently, Hunter Biden's laptop. Like, what's the truth with that, right? I've heard so many things. And there are some good websites that will share with you all of the articles and the sources and back them up. So Snopes.com is one, PolitiFact is another, factcheck.org, I think you might have mentioned that one, Judge. And they will actually go through with attribution of the facts about what has been supported about some of these issues that are in the news. So those are just a handful of tips that, that I could share.
And I'm not too worried about the people who are here tonight sorting through disinformation, but there's a lot of people out there who really need help. I would love to see television ads, newspaper ads, social media ads that tell people how to do this. I mean, that was a wonderful synopsis of things that every person can do in order to make sure they're getting the right story. And let's teach people about this. I mean, it goes along with the fact that we long ago stopped teaching civics education to our young people, and we're reaping the impact of that right now. We've started bringing school kids into our courthouse with our center to provide judicial education, the Justice and Democracy Center. And it's really amazing. Teachers are wanting to come in because they don't have the support from their schools for teaching civics education. And this is part of it. This is a civics lesson that people need to learn.
Mm-hmm. We have, Dave Beal is here in our audience, and so we have a couple of questions on local journalism. One of the questions is the loss of local journalism part of the problem? And then someone else says, could we start by trying to do something to help support our local, the survival of our local newspapers and media centers so that we have more local news covered? So I don't know if any of you feel that way.
Well, I think it is a real shame. You know, community newspapers are going the way of the dinosaurs, unfortunately. And I'm not sure why we can't subsidize local news. It's something that we all need to know about. Why can't we utilize government funds to subsidize local newspapers in all parts of our states? I mean, this is important understanding of local government and what they're doing and who's involved. I think that's perfectly legitimate, whether it has to be a nonprofit organization that owns a community newspaper. Maybe that's a way to do it, but I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah, I also think that community newspapers, local news, is similarly going through growing pains and a period of adjustment. I think part of it is you know, capacious capitalism. I mean, I'm a capitalist. I'm selling books, but capacious capitalism. You know, hedge funds are buying up these local newspapers and trying to squeeze all the profits out of them. And if they can't turn it into a, you know, multi-million-dollar business, then it folds and it's got to close up. But local media is really important. You know, it used to be said, I think it was Tip O'Neill who said all politics is local. But today, it seems that all politics is national. And I think it's because we don't have the same kind of local newspapers we used to have. So instead of talking about, who's fixing the roads, or are the street lights out, or is the garbage being picked up, instead we're talking about issues that are kind of beyond our control and make us feel a little bit hopeless about, immigration issues, or, I don't know, issues at the national stage, what's happening in the U.S. Supreme Court. And instead, we should be focusing on, what is it? Think globally, but act locally. And the ability to act locally, a big part of that is through local journalism, where we know what's happening at our city council and at our county commissions and our road commissions and our school boards. And we have reliable reporters about that. So I think sometimes we end up with unreliable reports about what's happening at these meetings because there's not a credible source who is there to report on what actually happened. I also think that local journalism is a great community builder. So we can all take pride when the local team wins the state championship in hockey, or the local kid wins the spelling bee or the science fair, and the local newspaper reports about that. So we can think about the things that we have in common as opposed to focusing on our differences. So I like this idea of finding ways to support it. You have to make sure you're not government direct subsidy of newspapers, because you want to make sure there's independent journalism, but I think you can have a buffer in there. In Michigan, one of the things I'm seeing is our foundation community, and I know you have a robust foundation community here, are taking it upon themselves to fund positions within newspapers, and so that's helping a little bit, but I think we need to do that on a broader scale.
We are getting questions. Barbara, this might be the broadest question you've been asked in any of your book tour presentations. Professor McQuaid, if you had a magic wand, what type of fact confirmation system would you implement? And now whoever this is gave a bunch of lists, citizens, newspapers, but basically, are these websites that are trying to confirm facts the way to go? Is there, are there just other tools that would help us try to confirm facts as we're reading?
Yeah, I don't know that there is one magic solution to all of this, even if I had the magic wand. And if I had the magic wand, I'd probably use it on the Detroit Lions even getting in a Super Bowl.
We're not going to give you that magic wand.
Yeah, I know you've never won a Super Bowl, but you've been there. You've been to the mountaintop. You've been there 4 times. The Lions have never even been there. And now you've got J.J. McCarthy from my alma mater, Michigan. So he's going to be fun to watch. You're going to enjoy him. So I'd wish for something like that. I don't know that there's any one solution for it, because I do think that we must tolerate ideas. And if you're going to allow the free expression of ideas, I think you have to tolerate some mistakes. It's why in our First Amendment, we have this actual malice standard for defamation that allows even mistakes in reporting, as long as there's no actual malice with deliberately false claims. And so, we have defamation laws there, but we allow a lot of grace. And so I think we need to allow that to make sure we have robust rights to free speech and to free press. But I think if we can remove some of these things, like the profit motive in outrage and the scraping of our personal data and anonymous accounts online who are spewing things, I think that can help. I think transparency is a really important part of this. I'm a big believer in more information is the way to beat out bad information. And so I think that if we can understand who it is are telling us things, if that gives us the tools to verify facts, I think that is the way to defeat it. I also think that, artificial intelligence is something that is very frightening to all of us, because we can't quite even imagine how it might be used against us. But I also think artificial intelligence could be a great tool. Like, how about using artificial intelligence to detect artificial intelligence? There's a researcher at the University of Michigan in Dearborn who is using AI to detect deep fakes made with AI. These videos that look real. And he is able to determine when they've been spliced versus when they're actually real or they've been doctored. So I think maybe technology is the solution to technology. So I don't know if there's any one magic wand remedy, but I think that we can be smart about this. Just need to have the political will to, keep chipping away. In my work in law enforcement, one of the things that was frustrating is we were always one step behind the bad guys. If there was a fraud scheme, it took us a little bit to figure it out, but then we figured it out. We would be able to prosecute them and arrest them. And then they'd move on to something new. It would evolve. And then we would move on and we would adjust as well. We may always be one step behind the disinformers, but that's okay as long as we don't get 20 steps behind, right? I think we have to keep doing all we can to catch up.
Well, we have just a couple minutes left before we need to wrap up. So we always try to leave on a high note and optimistic, even when we talk about some difficult topics like disinformation. So would each of you just say a few words of optimism for the audience, either what they can do or what you think the country will do on this problem?
Yes. The power to solve every problem created by humans resides in humans. And we're humans, right? We live in a country of, by, and for the people. We can control this. I had a wonderful experience just before the pandemic when I took a trip to Ireland. And I was there, and it happened to be during the time when they were having a national referendum on whether to repeal their ban on abortion. I mean, this is a country that has an official religion of Catholicism. And before we went, I heard this was happening. I thought, should we go? Will there be civil unrest in the streets? I don't know. Maybe we ought to postpone our trip. But we went, and it was fascinating to see the way they were discussing this issue with such civility. There were people on every street corner. It was a very, very engaged citizenry in this issue. Everybody was very interested. And some street corners, there were people passing out pamphlets with the yay side and others on the nay side. And they would ask if you were interested in learning more about it. They would hand you a pamphlet. They would discuss with you. But they would do so with great respect, regardless of what your position was. And everyone I saw talking with them discussed it with great respect. I think one of the things that has been so corrosive to our democracy is this ginning up of anger. And again, it goes back to this idea of deliberately polarizing our electorate and trying to double down on the base because we have to point to the other side as our enemy. We are not enemies, we are friends, we are Americans. And I think we have to remember all that we have in common and not allow politicians to pit us against each other. Whether that message is coming from hostile foreign adversaries like Russia or from politicians in our own country, we have to remember that it is about unity and moving our society forward together. Political purity will get us nowhere. Politics is the art of compromise, and so we have to accept half a loaf if we ever want to get anywhere. And so I think we all have the power within us to talk with our neighbors and our friends with that grace, with that respect, and help those who've gone down this rabbit hole of disinformation, to lend them a hand and help pull them back out. We can get through this together through love, grace, and unity.
Very well said. I always ask potential jurors when I'm questioning them before a trial where they get the news each day. Lawyers would like to know that. They like to know where people are looking for news. And years ago, it was always the Star Tribune, it was KARE 11, WCCO, MPR, sometimes Fox News. Today, most of the potential jurors are saying my Google feed, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, or whatever comes up on my mobile phone. And you delve a little deeper, and part of it is, they'll watch TV once in a while, but everything that costs money is a problem for a lot of people. The sites that people go to aren't equal. And I don't know if I saw this in your book, Barbara, but the idea that people have to pay to get online news, go through that paywall, I think is a problem. I mean, maybe we should be funding that so that everything is out there and available to people so that they can read the Wall Street Journal as well as they can read, something that's free that is not reliable and is filled with disinformation. I mean, I think this is an idea that we should follow up on. I know it costs money to produce a digital replica of your news or your newspaper or whatever you're looking at, but let's make it equal for everybody. I mean, I probably would read a Wall Street Journal article about once a week. I'm interested, but boy, I click on it and there's that paywall saying, oh, you can subscribe for $200 a year or something like that. And a lot of people can't do that. And so they don't have access to reliable news organizations that can give them the news that they want. And people, for better or for worse, are looking at their phones or their tablets for news. They're not looking at a newspaper. They're not rarely watching television news anymore. So I think that's something that that could be done. My final point, though, is that I think we can teach people how to be good users of social media if we really put our minds to it and put money behind it, get appropriations going to have advertisements on television and what to look for when you're reading the news and to what to look out for disinformation. And I think it's an important national security issue because we know the Russians, the Chinese, perhaps the Iranians, they will be trying to influence this election. And most people aren't going to be able to tell the difference between something that they come up with and something that is legitimate. So I think we can do it.
That's optimism. Well, Tom, do you want to tie this all together?
Shall I go up there?
You don't, come on up.
Okay. So I want to thank Janet and Barbara and Jack for a marvelous program tonight. I think we should give them all a round of applause. Really excellent. So speaking for the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, we are so pleased to be partnering with the Minnesota Peace Initiative. This kind of collaboration is just what we need. The Twin Cities, Minnesota has a tradition of collaboration, of volunteerism, and moving forward on citizens' education, I think we should be doing more and more of this kind of collaboration. I'll just make a couple of final remarks. As Jack pointed out, this year is an unprecedented year for elections. Over 60 countries, 3 billion people, sorry. And already you can see in the results that have come in a trend that unfortunately is out there. And that is that the information issues that we're talking about now are a threat before elections, but they're used after elections as well. And so we have elected autocrats, managed democracies emerging, in which people are elected freely, but then turn around and use these. Russia, of course, is a case in point. Pakistan's recent election, where the candidate who won was disqualified, is another perfect example. So we have to be vigilant against that, at home and abroad. The other thing is trust. Trust is the coin of the realm. And if that begins to erode, it's death for a democracy. And a lot of the way that the information is flowing now, the new media, is leading to what Stephen Colbert called some years ago truthiness. He coined that phrase. And so this erosion has been going on for quite a while. Walter Lippmann, way back in the 1920s, saw mass advertising as the beginning of a threat to democracy. Because advertising is great, but it's not usually true. And working in the Congress, I watched how the very methods of advertising were then applied to campaigns, to negative ads. And I worked with a senator who did not want to go that way, to use advertising principles in an election, but was told there's no other way because your opponent will do that. There's a new media conundrum that I want to mention. There are a lot of echo chambers out there, that's true, in the new media. But if I look at younger people, I teach, and so I have a lot of contact with young folks. They get their news in a completely different way from the way we do. And they're very skeptical of corporate media. They see filtered news coming through our corporate media. And they see these new, questionable, if you will, sources of new online as liberating them from that, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And so we've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess is my feeling. These new tools are having a positive impact in many ways as well. I want to kind of conclude with something that Neil Postman pointed out way back in the mid-1980s. He took George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and saw two threats to democracy. For Orwell, it was the fear that the truth would be concealed, would be controlled from us. For Huxley, it was that the truth would be drowned out in a tsunami of irrelevant information. And I think part of the problem is there's so many new information sources, people are just inundated with information, that we risk becoming not what Orwell called a captive culture, but a trivial culture in which the politics gets caught up in this. So having said that, I want to be optimistic here and say that I think it is true that AI can very well be used as a counter tool against some of the AI that's going on. And we just have to do this in a resolute way. And also, obviously, citizens education, youth education is key. Love, grace, and unity, I agree 1,000% with. We are fear-based as humans, and therefore we have to see the threat that is looming before us and not sleepwalk. I mean, we have to really wake up and see that things have to be done now to rebalance this adolescent situation we're in. So once again, thank you to our panelists, and I'll turn it over to Janet.
Thank you very much, Tom, and I hope that this is the first of many programs that we co-sponsor together and work together on. So I think it's worked out very well. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank our speakers for an excellent program. Barbara, thank you for joining us this evening. As a faithful listener to your Sisters-in-Law podcast, I know that you are off to Detroit for a live performance tomorrow, so we appreciate that you made time to stop here on your way there. And speaking of your live podcast, I know from last weekend's show from Chicago that you are a baseball fan. And that at that time you were wearing a Cubs cap. So we can't let you leave Minnesota without a Twins cap. And if you want to show us how much you really love us, you'll wear that in Detroit tomorrow. Judge Thunheim, we know that you have a busy, busy court docket and you travel the world. And so we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be here tonight, and we really appreciate it very much. And we have a beautiful gift for each of you. It's a Viking drinking mug. But it is lovely and it's handmade, and you'll get all the information for it when you receive it. So, yeah. Okay. I also want to thank the Norway House Board of Directors, many of whom are here this evening, as well as their executive team. And that includes Christina Carlton, who's the CEO of the Norway House, and Joseph Grodal, who is the Programs and Operation Director of the Norway House. They did a great job supporting the program and the webinar, so I hope we'll give them all a big round of applause. I'd also like to thank all of my colleagues on the team, on the committee. Mark Knapp is here. Mark, will you stand up? Mark was so committed. My original script said, Mark can't be here, he's in the air. And he came here directly from the airport, so we appreciate it very much. I also want to thank the committee members, and any of the committee members that are here, if you would please stand up. I see some out in the hall, so come in and be acknowledged. So come on in. And and you don't hear this word very often. Our committee's a lot of fun. We have a very good time. And any of you that like these programs, are interested in global affairs and what it could, what's going on in the world, we invite you to join us on our committee. I also encourage you to visit the Norway House website. This webinar will be available there. Also, the Norway House has its own YouTube channel, and it will be available on YouTube within the week. On the website, you can also learn more about not only the Norway House and its missions, but certainly its upcoming programs. There's always a lot going on at the Norway House. Couple of housekeeping items. There are cards on each of your chairs. That's a survey. We really value your input so we can continue to build better and better programs going forward. So we would really appreciate your feedback. And also, Barbara was available before the program, but despite having to get to Detroit, she will be available after the program for those of you who brought books and want them signed or want her to sign the author card for you out there. Before we leave, we want to honor Larry Bakken for his contributions to the Norway House and the success of the Minnesota Peace Initiative program. As many of you know, we lost Larry recently. In fact, many of us said goodbye to him yesterday at his memorial service. Larry was such a citizen of the world. He devoted his life to law and legal education, as well as international law and legal student exchange programs. Larry served on numerous committees and commissions. He gave his all to spreading the benefits and wonders of democracy and the rule of law. Larry led our Minnesota Peace Initiative committee for several years. He was always available to everyone. He was very creative. He knew everyone in town, and he contributed so much to the success of the Minnesota Peace Initiative. Larry, we think the world of you, and we will never forget all that you did for all of us. So, talk for Alt. Our committee will be making a contribution in Larry's name to the Golden Valley Historical Society, which was one of Larry's many passions. So let's have a big round of applause for Larry. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. We were so glad to see such a good turnout. And we want to also thank everyone who joined us online, and we hope you will join us for future programs. We hope in particular that you leave more confident that while disinformation, especially in elections, is a difficult nut to crack, there are things we can do, and we all need to be good information consumers and good citizens and push for the change needed. The Minnesota Peace Initiative was established because democracy is not a spectator sport. We believe everyone needs to be informed and engaged to support our democracy. So please join us for our program this fall. And as we always say before you leave, if it's happening in the news, we'll be talking about it at the Minnesota Peace Initiative. Thank you very much. Safe travels.